see so many familiar and beloved faces. Sant Jordi NYC began 10 years ago. Well, Sant Jordi has been celebrated in New York for over 100 years. It was in 1920, sorry, the Catalan Nationalist Center was founded, which then turned into the Catalan Cultural Center and then turned into Friends of Catalonia after the Civil War. But in 2014, and Alex was one of the people who took part in 2014, the Farragut Fund for Catalan Culture in the United States, which is my little not-for-profit, and the Catalan Institute of America got together and we decided we wanted to share Sant Jordi beyond the Catalan community. So we decided to devote the festival to literatures and translation. And so the first Sant Jordi was a lid crawl in Dumbo from one bookstore to another. And Alex was the second reader, right? You read it.
I don't remember that well.
You were the second reader because who translates from Polish?
Sean?
Sean Bai was the first reader and the second. And so we went from bookstore to bookstore and gathered people as we walked. It was like the Pied Pipers of Hamelin. And in the last bookstore, Powerhouse, it was a big Catalan festival. So it was a wonderful and auspicious start. And we continued doing it. In 2017, we did a week of events, and then there was the referendum on independence in Catalonia, and then it became harder to do things. And then in 2020, we were about to start up again, and COVID. So, but the wonderful thing is that I work with a team of multimedia artists, Isabel Diverger, who's right back there, and Laia Cabrera. This is the beautiful, all of the beautiful images. For example, I'll show you in a minute. And between the next, we talked, and I said, well, what about if we go online? And in 3 hours, Isabel had a platform, the first drawing for the platform, and we discovered our international audience. And so now Sant Jordi is something that, this year we have someone who translates from Mauritian Creole, for example. But we do try to bring, give a platform to all languages. And so this year we got in touch with the West Village Business Improvement District. And of course, since the West Village is the cradle of American literature, Zach Owens, the head of the West Village Beat, said, I was thinking of doing a literary festival. And so they adopted us, and they've made it possible for us to have the space and to have the festival in the street. And that is a new stage for us, and it's very exciting. So after 10 years, we're finally, and so today, we're going to be talking about, everything we do kind of upends the canons. I like to think so. And today, we're going to be upending the European canon at first by talking about an 18th century novelist who was a bestseller. Anyway, Kate will tell you all about that.
I'm a professor of humanities and social sciences at LIU Brooklyn. I'm a longtime review editor for Translation Review and a former president of ALTA, the American Literary Translators Association. I think I know you from ATA mostly, right? And I mostly translate from all from Spanish, but mostly poetry and a little drama. I have a specialty in specialization in meter and rhyme. I've done the golden age of Spanish drama for Norton, and a forthcoming from Oxford World's Classics is the Argentine Gaucho epic of Martin Fierro and Martin Fierro's Return. First Latin American title in the Oxford World's Classics out of their 750 titles. They only have 5 in Spanish, 2 Lorca, 2 Cervantes, and 1 Lope. So it is kind of a groundbreaking effort. I'm proud to be part of it. Thanks, everyone.
So I'll just start with a brief reading from the novel, and just to kind of set the scene, So the novel, if I didn't mention the title, it's the story of the Marquis de Cressy. And there's a girl named Adelaide who is in love with the Marquis de Cressy. After rejecting her for not being wealthy enough to marry, now he's changed his tune and he's told her that he wants to marry her. So in this scene, the Marquis meets Adelaide in a garden at night, and her maid, Hélène, is also there, so she's also mentioned. And this is a scene of emotional manipulation that turns into an attempted sexual assault, although it's written without concrete physical details. He became insistent, bold. The same favors he had stolen a few days before, with repeated resistance and gradual agreement, could not satisfy him. He asked constantly, received always, and complained again. His heated breaths, smothered by the violence of his desires, his feigned tears, his submissive, ardent pleading, and this apparently simple phrase, used so often and always too powerful on a woman's heart, "You don't love me. If you loved me," repeated over and over again. All this upset Adelaide. She was in love and could not stand to see her lover doubt her feelings. From one moment to the next, he required new proof, and the more she gave, the less he seemed inclined to limit his demands. Hélène was far off, and the somewhat overcast weather made the garden thoroughly dark, which was opportune for Monsieur de Cressy's intentions. The affectionate and credulous Adelaide, led by him under some thick foliage, abandoned to the imprudence of her age, her ignorance of danger, and her faith in her lover, seemed to have forgotten herself. Her heart, entirely given over to love, was not distracted by any other object. Without foreseeing where a fallacious question would lead her, she had answered. She had said she wanted him to be happy. She would do anything to ensure his happiness. She was still saying this when the boldness of the Marquis, taken to its extreme, drawing her from this dangerous intoxication, restored her reason and the strength to oppose what he was trying to do. She tore herself from his arms with a cry of horror, and rushing out of the thicket, she called loudly for Hélène, without worrying in her fear if others could hear her. Hélène rushed over. Adelaide, somewhat reassured to see her, did not have the strength to stand up, but leaned against a tree. Letting her head fall on the breast of this girl whom she held tight, she began to cry with all the signs of extreme sorrow. The Marquis, ashamed of an attempt that had succeeded so badly, kneeling at her feet, endeavored to soothe her, but in vain. She did not listen to him and continued to weep without seeming to be aware of his presence or his submissiveness. Finally, making an effort to control herself, she pushed him away with her hand and took a few steps. With her eyes bathed in tears, she raised her gaze to the heavens and cried, "Oh, my father, you warned me, and it is only too true. The man who hid his intentions from you was plotting against me." She walked for a while without going far, reflecting deeply. Then, leaning on Hélène, she started walking home without responding a single time to anything the Marquis said to sway her. She was about to go back inside when he stopped her and begged her to listen to him. "I will hear nothing," she said with disdain. "I scorn and detest you. Now I understand the reasons for your strange behavior with a girl to whom you owed respect, and whom anyone other than you would not have chosen as the object of an amusement that the lowest of her sex could provide for you. I have been punished, cruelly punished," she added, "for this fateful preconception that made me love you and made me believe you deserved all the love I felt for you. How skillfully you deceived me, and how little my heart suspected it. But this heart escapes you. No, it no longer belongs to you, and views as beneficial the arrow which, tearing it apart, enlightens it as to the baseness of your own heart. Give me back my letter," she continued. "Give me back this sign of an abhorrent weakness. And if I ever recall the unfortunate inclination that drew me to you, may it be only to remember how unworthy of it you were. the Marquis, dismayed by these reproaches, still hesitated. He didn't know what he should do. He didn't want to return her letter, and he begged her to let him keep the only token he had of her kindness. He insisted, he wept, and he said everything he thought could calm her mind and quell her anger. But nothing could erase the impression she had just received of his character. The time of deceiving her was over. Wounded to the depths of her heart, she could no longer forgive. She repeated her demand with a tone and expressions that forced the Marquis to agree to it. As soon as she had her letter, she walked away hurriedly and went back inside without deigning to listen to Monsieur de Cressy's excuses or pleading. What a night the sad Adelaide spent. There is no anguish more difficult to bear than that caused by love. Such pain is intensified by reflection and combines shame with oppressive sadness. She trembled in thinking of the danger she had risked. The good fortune of having avoided it was a consolation to her. But at what cost did she enjoy it? By the loss of her desires, her love, all the appealing plans that had so pleasantly occupied her. She had to give up all her hopes. She had to despise the man whom she still adored.
True confessions. Kate and I tried not to collude, and we shamelessly failed. And I didn't want to turn this into a quiz. So I just have a couple questions, and maybe pop-fall questions, still sort of introductory questions. Like, I have a background in comparative literature, but not in French. I have never heard of this author or this work, and I'm wondering how you came across her.
Yeah, so I first heard of Riccoboni when I was in grad school because she had a correspondence with Laclos, the author of Les Liaisons Dangereuses. And she objected, in that correspondence, she objected to the character of Madame de Merteuil, whom she thought was too horrible. She thought was just too horrible to have really existed, or to be the kind of woman who could ever exist. So they had a disagreement about this. But I never read anything by her. And it wasn't until fairly recently that I discovered this novel because it was reissued in France in affordable paperback editions. So she's kind of been, rediscovered in France. So I wanted to read it. And then after I read it, I thought, well, gee, are there any, has it ever been translated? And there's only been one translation, which was in 1765. So I thought, okay, well, maybe she should be rediscovered, in English as well. So that's what gave me the idea to translate her. So.
Going through your introduction, I think with respect to this correspondence with Laclos, you said there seemed to be a dichotomy. They were sort of going back and forth about the male or the masculine being tied up with related to the rational and female emotional. And one of the questions was that Laclos did not think that this character could have acted in such a dastardly fashion as a woman. Was that the issue? That
Riccoboni thought that, yeah. And I think that, partly I think it was kind of a polemically driven discussion, because I think that she did not want, she saw herself as an advocate for women, and she thought that this character was kind of an insult to women's character. So that's why she wanted to, refuse that someone so calculating.
Right. Calculating was the word that I wanted, not dastardly. Right. And, it surprised me too. Here's an author, let's face it, little known, at least in Anglophone ambits. She was famous enough or talented enough to live off her writings, and she may have been the best-selling author of the entire 18th century. So someone posits that. So clearly she had some sort of reputation in France. How is it that she's so little known today?
Yeah, well, I think probably the main reason for that has to do with the way French literature was interpreted. Ever since the French Revolution, looking back on the 18th century, it was always viewed as the age of reason, and literature was valued and authors were valued who could be part of kind of this historical movement toward political freedom. And so because of that, then a lot of domestic and sentimental novels, which were often written by women, were kind of neglected because they didn't really fit into that narrative. And of course, that's kind of a simplification, right? Because the 18th century in France, just as much as being an age of reason, it's just as much an age of passion, of sensibility, of pathos, and all these other things that maybe at first glance, didn't get the same emphasis as kind of the rational mode.
Yeah, you're right that really the novel doesn't really take off as a genre, or is not considered seriously until the 19th century. Right? What came to mind, I actually had to look it up, was Scribbling Women, with Hawthorne's line from 1860. But she, during her own time, was compared to Diderot and Voltaire, and these, rather canonical figures were novelists, among other things. Right?
Yeah, and of course, and to put that in context, as you say, since the novel was kind of undervalued, the authors that we admire today, a lot of the things that we admire them for, that's not what their contemporaries admire them for. So like when we think of Voltaire, we think of Candide, but his contemporaries thought of, his plays, his plays in rhymed verse, right? Which today, most people don't read. So there was a whole hierarchy of genres too, which also contributed to Riccoboni not, getting the same kind of attention ultimately as some of these other figures.
Yeah, I remember Cervantes. He thought his masterpiece was the Trials of Segismund and Persiles. It's terrible. If you've ever read it, it's absolutely a horrific work. Maybe we've answered this, but we were talking a little bit about in translation studies. There's a theory called polysystem theory, and basically this is a very, very crude reduction. It asks, why this translation by this translator at this time? Is there something in particular that drew you to this novelist, or this novel? She has 8 novels?
Yeah.
6 of them are epistolary, right? Yeah. And so this is the one you chose, and why was that?
Yeah, well, to be honest, the epistolary ones I think haven't quite aged as well as the non-epistolary ones. Yeah. So that narrows it down quite a bit. But I think this novel, there were some, formal and stylistic characteristics that I liked about it. It is like really well written. I mean, she was admired for her style, and she has a very very elegantly composed style. It's also very tightly constructed and tightly plotted. And then I think and then it's also written with a lot of the sentences in here could almost be kind of plucked out and used as like maxims of like human behavior. So she has a lot of really interesting understanding of psychology, which I really enjoyed. And then of course there's the fact that the questions of men and women and of female agency, that those are very pertinent questions still today, which I think, as modern readers, I think that's something that, can intrigue us about this novel.
Well, one of the fun facts in your introduction is that, I'm not sure it's true, it was maybe anecdotal, that Marie Antoinette was a great fan, and she would rebind her breviary or her prayer book, this book, to look like a prayer book in church, so she could read Riccoboni.
Yeah, so she could secretly read Riccoboni, so.
I thought that was funny. I don't know why I do this, but I often do quiz the audience. Quick name an epistolary novel. I understand why you didn't translate an epistolary novel. They can be heavy slides. Frankenstein?
I was going to say Frankenstein.
Dracula, I think, too. Sorrows of Young... Sorrows of Young Werther, I'm thinking. And is Pamela?
Yes.
Pamela? For you...
Les Liaisons Dangereuses. That one is marriage.
No, I agree, but and 6 of the 8 novels were in fact epistolary, right? There's, that would be a tough slog. When you everyone here knows that, or everyone who's in the biz, when you pitch a book to a publisher, they want to know what the readership is going to be, and of course they're partially thinking about sales, but also where precisely this book is going to fit in. How would you answer that? What is the readership? I mean, there's MLA is publishing it. In their, what are they
So
called?
it's texts and translations.
Yeah, the text and translation series. It can be pretty academic. I mean, the only book I've read in that series is Hispanic American Modernismo, I think, which was I thought a fine book. But where do you see this fitting in? If you had to pitch this is...
Yeah, well, I have pitched it, so. The text and translation series is, it's mostly for classroom use. I mean, they're also bilingual, so there's a French volume and an English volume. So that's actually nice because you could have a class where, if you had a class in like, women's history or something, you could have people reading it in French and other students reading it in English. And they're really attractive volumes too, which I like. So even though they're made, it's an academic press, they're paperback, they have nice art, so they're nice. And yeah, in terms of how she fits into literary history, some scholars have already said that she was an influence on Laclos, actually, when he wrote Les Liaisons Dangereuses, that this novel, the story of the Marquis de Cressy, some of the characters inspired him for developing his own characters. And I think that Riccoboni is interesting because she does kind of complicate that picture of, a libertine novel. Those are, pretty much exclusively written by men. And then you have sentimental novels written by some men, but a lot of women authors. So you have these kind of two opposing genres. And this novel is really interesting because on the one hand, it has all these sentimental themes and it's about love and it's about women characters, but then it also has this kind of dark, tragic aspect to it. And so in that respect, and asking questions like, how do people, mostly men, how do men really know themselves, and do they really know their own motivations? How are they? What's motivating them to act the way they are, and where's their self-control coming from, or their lack of self-control? That kind of aspect is where she kind of overlaps with Laclos, even though they butted heads. They actually have kind of a similar vision in some respect, kind of a somber vision of human nature. And it did make me think a little bit too. I'm not as familiar with English authors, but an author like Fanny Burney, who had to be kind of reestablished, whose reputation had to get reestablished when she was kind of neglected for a while. Yeah. All these kind of precursors to modern novelists. Riccoboni could kind of serve as one of those in a way, I think. Yeah.
One of the terms I use, I also translate often, retranslate works from a few centuries back. I don't even know what to call them. I don't like to say classical because people think Greek and Roman. I use this kind of weasel word, vintage, and they're not vintage, and they're certainly not canonical because they've dropped out of the canon. But rescue and obscurity and oblivion, this is really an endeavor of rescue.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think like a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight, it also shows that like there's not just one narrative of literary history, right? There are a lot of, there are a lot of different threads that are kind of interwoven together that make up a literary culture.
One of the things that interested me again in the introduction was that, for example, in the excerpt you read, the failed sexual assault is muted. And yet there's a kind of an open female eroticism that some people complained about was kind of daring for its day. Could you talk about that? I saw that in your translation.
Yeah, well, I think that Riccoboni was a pretty brave author for a woman author writing in the 18th century, because her first novel, this was her second novel, and her first novel, which is a one-sided epistolary novel about and it's actually quite good, a woman who's been betrayed by her lover. So it's just her own letters, and they have a much more frank attitude towards sex than you would expect from the time period. And of course, that was something, she was really kind of putting her reputation at risk by writing something like this, because female authors were always identified with their protagonists. Yeah. And she did it anyway. So it was it's a really interesting, unusual step to take.
They didn't have the advantage of 20th century literary theory, no authorial intention, right? I'm going to shift the focus here maybe to an ending question about first translations and retranslations. There's a lot of discussion in the translation studies canon about what a first translation should look like or sound like. Some people think it should be very literal. This is the second, but you have 250 years, right, between. Did you have any interaction with that text? And overall, what was your methodology, knowing that there was a previous translation?
Yeah, I was able to find that translation from 1765 online. I didn't read it, but I did go back a couple times. If I encountered a tricky passage, I went back to check and see how that translator had done it, to see if that would help me at all. And yeah, I was probably somewhat more literal than I might have been in a lot of my other translation work, partly because if it's going to be published in this series with a French and an English volume, I kind of felt like they kind of needed to line up in a way. I didn't want people reading, vastly different, versions. The main liberty that I took was to break up the sentences because, and when you hear what I read, I mean, that's broken up. So they were even, their sentences are even longer than that. I know it can be kind of dense. So a lot of clauses going on, and so I did break up sentences because it just became so unwieldy for a reader today.
Yeah. I think that's going to be it for me. Do you have a final comment, something you'd still like to say?
Does anybody in the audience?
Oh, yeah, or we can take a question or two.
And then you could save it for the end. We could see how things overlap. Does anyone have a question they'd like to pose right now?
I totally, well, actually not totally randomly. I did a sample from a novel by a Czech author, woman, in which the three main characters are John D. Rockefeller, Božena Němcová, who was the first big Czech female novelist, and George Sand. I haven't read anything by George Sand, so I decided to read Indiana. Mm-hmm. And this reminds me a lot of that. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if George Sand, if you have any idea, a woman who wrote under a man's name in order to be accepted, but this reminds me a lot of that, both in terms of the thinking of the characters and the style. Have you read George Sand?
I have.
This was also a new translation from the early 90s. Of course, I can't remember the translator's name, just an embarrassment.
Yeah,
I know, right? Do you know?
I haven't read.
That's a very random question.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. That's really interesting. I haven't read Indiana. George Sand is someone that, obviously I've heard about very much, but haven't really taken the time to read. I have read some of her. She has a really long autobiography, and I have read some of her autobiography.
What reminded me of it was there were a lot of scenes where it's the woman with her maid in the room, and it's like that whole social milieu of that's how people, even though it was a man and a woman together, there was a maid in the room.
Yeah. And she also, actually come to think of it, I think maybe, I do remember reading something by George Sand where she writes about how women are always stuck doing embroidery and how boring it is to have to spend your life sitting around doing embroidery. So she has a very kind of, skeptical look at women's role in society. So
it's about a century later than this.
The question, maybe another question is, did George Sand read?
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder if she could have been an influence. I don't know, but now I'm going to try to find out. That's a really good thing.
From the translator's perspective, do you use a target culture model? Would you try to sound George Sandian or to sound whatever you think is a kind of an English language counterpart to Riccoboni? I don't usually do that. I kind of rely on, just literary history memory, more feel than that. But I know some people actually some translators look for models.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you.
Let's invite Sanches and Emma Ramadan to come to the stage.
Emma Ramadan, award-winning translator and educator, also former bookstore owner and bookseller and cocktail maker, from California, of Lebanese and English parents, currently living in New York City. Wow. Translator of Abdellah Taïa's Living in Your Light. I just read this book today and I've already forgotten the title, I'm sorry. And of many other translators like Virginie Despentes, who's the author of Panics?
Barbara Molinar.
Barbara Molinar, excellent book, Panics, and countless others.
That's great. Thank you, Julia. Julia Sanchez, who translates from Portuguese, Catalan, Spanish, and also sometimes French, correct? From Brazil, living in Rhode Island, my favorite state. Former bookseller, current, are you a scout right now?
No.
Former scout, former agent, current very prolific translator, recent winner of the Penn Translation Prize for, is it Migratory Birds? By
Mariana Oliver.
Yeah. And also of Eva Baltazar's Boulder, and another one by Eva Baltazar that's also very good.
Permafrost.
Permafrost. And countless other translations.
Very good, ladies.
Now you can all go home. No. So when Marianne and I started talking about this, I was looking at what I have coming up, and I realized that there's this author called Meryem El Mehdati, who is a Spanish writer from the Canary Islands of Moroccan extraction, and how one thing in our translations that Emma and I have in common are translating European writers of North African descent. And so I thought that could be interesting in the way that troubles who counts as European. And then the books that we've translated by these authors are wildly different. The two authors I'll be talking about, Munir Hachemi and Meryem El Mehdati, could not be more different. Abdellah Taïa is also writing in a very different vein. And so we wanted to read a little bit. We're hurtling into the present. It'll feel very different from our last wonderful reading. And so I'll read a little bit, and then Emma will, and then I will, since I'll be talking about two different authors. And this first excerpt is from Munir Hachemi's Living Things, his debut novel. And I'm throwing you into the book a little later, but the novel is very difficult to summarize because it's a coming-of-age story that follows four recent Spanish graduates who travel to the south of France to work in the grape harvest and find material to write about. But then things go terribly wrong, and it becomes a book about mega farms and veganism, and it's a thriller, and it's about capitalism and labor. And so in this scene, our four characters have made it to the south of France, and they have shown up at like a temp agency to see if they can find work on a vineyard so that they can become tan and lean and handsome and then also write about it. AST was in the center of Air. It consisted of a single room, a kind of office space devoid of decorations, with stacks of paper all over. Behind the counter, a chubby French woman with a big smile was chatting with a Moroccan man in his 30s. He was dark-skinned, dark-haired, and terribly thin, too gaunt and bony for his age. We found out later that his name was Mohammed, and he was from Fez. He had black, sunken eyes that looked straight through you and a hooked Arab nose. He spoke very little and knew, or perhaps couldn't help it, how to make people cower in his presence. His lips were thin and a scar yarned his mouth, where some of his teeth were missing. The fat woman greeted us far too effusively, all while giggling and squealing. Her first words to us were addressed to G, whom she asked for a glass of water from one of those plastic dispensers used in first world countries to keep the temperature cool. G didn't understand a word she said, of course, and the woman, down whose face and neck rolled large pearls of sweat despite the loud fan pointed right at her, asked if we spoke French. I said we did, while Ernesto, being more practical, went to the water cooler to get the woman, what she had asked for. The Moroccan guy seemed uncomfortable. Maybe he didn't like people standing behind him, or we rubbed him the wrong way. In any case, he kept scratching the back of his neck and glancing at us over his shoulder. He quickly signed something and closed the folder, holding it out to the woman while mumbling some implausible, unnecessary excuse. He eyed us with a mix of hatred and distrust, then got up and left without saying goodbye. The woman found the Moroccan man's behavior totally normal. She introduced herself. Her name was Elodie, and she was in charge of AST. She took the glass Ernesto held out for her and asked what she could do for us. Que puis-je faire pour vous? Alex and G smiled and nodded, an attitude they kept up throughout the rest of the conversation. Feeling protective of his mother's friend's reputation, who had told them to go to AST. Ernesto had made us dress nice, which had translated into everyone but him looking patently ridiculous. We'd promised to keep our composure and make a good impression, So I stifled the urge to laugh at the sight of Alex with his mohawk and button-down shirt, and G in swimming trunks and dress shoes, borrowed from Ernesto naturally, smiling and nodding like idiots as I explained to Elodie that we'd come to work the grape harvest, that we wanted to be part of une équipe, a squad. By then the heat, claustrophobia, and sugar high had got to me. That we'd rented a caravan at Les Ombrages campground, but hadn't signed anything about a minimum stay period, so we're free to leave at any time. Much as it seemed like a great place, and well located too. That we could request references from the owner. We'd only been there a day, but had picked up on a certain feeling. Le feeling, I said. Though obviously we'd prefer somewhere with guaranteed room and board, even if it was docked from our wages, and so long, it goes without saying, as the price was reasonable. They could dock our room or our board, but not both. I fell quiet at the sight of Ernesto staring at me wide-eyed while Alex and G had stopped nodding along to look at me. I'd been spouting everything I knew about the grape harvest, which wasn't a lot, while the woman erratically jotted down a few details. What I mean by erratically is that she didn't write anything when I made an important point, but at seemingly random junctures, as if she had decided to note down only my prepositions and adverbs. I leaned forward in my seat, hoping to catch her writing to, for, in, of, for example, or, well, quickly, obviously, very, but saw nothing, and Ernesto pulled me back by the shoulder. We were all sweating buckets and pining for Elodie's fan. Meanwhile, I had started feeling a bit under the weather, almost feverish. In that moment of silence, Ernesto informed me I'd been raving like a lunatic, and went on to give Elodie a more structured account of our story. He talked about Paul, his mother's friend, about horses in the grape harvest. Paul's name, which should have acted as a sort of magic word, judging by the expectations created during our road trip, had no effect. Elodie declared she didn't know anyone called Paul, certainly not that Paul. Ernesto wrapped up his story feeling less confident. The situation was incredibly surreal, while Elodie went on taking notes without rhyme or reason. As soon as Ernesto was done, the woman looked at us and said, "You do know there isn't going to be a grape harvest this summer, right?" So I guess now Emma will read. I'm going to print out the terrible shots I sent you. I'm sorry. But the reason I picked that excerpt is because the protagonist is this young man from Spain who grew up of mixed heritage, and all of his characters, especially the character who's named after him, this is autofiction, and the other book I translated was also autofiction, has absorbed all of the racism and the sexism and the sizeism that he has witnessed in Spain and grown up with. And so I thought that could be interesting for us to look at.
Yeah, that's great. I love the scar yarned across his mouth.
I don't know
why.
why.
I love that. I'm going to read from Abdellah Taïa's Living in Your Light, which came out with 7 stories in February. And Abdellah Taïa's, he is called the first openly gay Moroccan writer, and technically that is true. There is another, very well published gay Moroccan writer, but he publishes under a pseudonym. And Abdellah lives in Paris now, has lived in Paris since he was, for decades now. And all of his writing is sort of concerned with the North African immigrant living in France or Morocco itself, or something, something along those lines. And this book is kind of special for him and different than his other books because it's specifically about his mother's life, and this is actually a picture of her. And she, her full name is Mbarka Alali, and the heroine of the book is named Malika, and it's told in 3 parts. So there's Malika at the beginning when she gets married to this man named Alal, and then quickly realizes that he's actually gay and has a gay lover, and the 3 of them become this sort of unit. But then her husband Alal is sent off to, or I guess sort of volunteers to go fight for the French in Indochina, promised all this money upon his return that would, allow them to go separate from his parents and live, the 3 of them. And of course he dies there, and his parents keep all the money and kick out Malika. And then the second part of the book, Malika is waging this kind of battle with a white French woman who has come to Morocco, has some connection to Morocco, and wants to hire Malika's daughter Khadija as a maid. And Malika does not want that. And then the third part of the book, maybe I'll leave as a surprise. I'm just going to read from the beginning of the first part and then the beginning of the second part. And it's mostly based on real events, but it's also this act of extreme empathy of him. He and his mother had a very complicated relationship. She never fully accepted him, and this book is really this beautiful imagining of why she was the way she was. Okay. So this is Malika speaking to about Alal coming to ask for her hand. You came back to see us a month later to ask for my hand. Both of your parents were with you, and your best friend too, Merzoug. He's my brother, more than my brother, I heard you say to my father when you introduced him. Merzoug. Sometimes a friend is much better than a brother. You're right, Alal. Merzoug was seated next to you, glued to you. When I entered the living room of our house to serve everyone mint tea, Merzoug said, she's lucky, your daughter. Baba didn't ask for much money as a dowry, almost nothing. But to your parents, Alal, he spoke from the heart. Malika will be your daughter. I give her to you. I'm not selling her. I am entrusting her to you. I'm not forcing Malika to do anything. She is your daughter. Life will smile on her with you and your son Alal. Life will finally reward her. I'm counting on you. Hearing these words, my stepmother stood up and left the living room. She wanted to show her disapproval of Baba's words and what he was implying. I went to check whether or not the couscous was ready. Baba continued his speech. My daughter Malika lost her mother at a very young age. I couldn't raise her on my own. In this life, a man cannot weather the storm without a wife. I married again. I had no choice. Your father then began speaking. Your daughter Malika will be our daughter. Do not worry. And our son Alal is your son. God will guide us on this path as good Muslims with pure hearts. But what? The dowry is a bit too substantial for our son. How much money can you give for my daughter? This isn't about money. Trust is the most important thing. How much? That's for you to decide. Our son is a good son, a man. He is not afraid of work. He is how much? Half of what you asked. Baba turned toward me. He took my hand in his. Malika, my daughter, you've heard what has just been said. Are you okay with all of this? I'm not forcing you to do anything. Do you want to marry Alal under these conditions? You won't tell me later that I sold you for nothing? Alal is here in front of you. His parents are here in front of you. You have heard everything they said, their proposition. Money isn't everything in life, but sometimes you have to know, I'm okay with it, Baba. I want to marry Alal. I accept what his parents propose. You've all heard it. My daughter Malika agrees. She's your daughter now. She's yours. She's yours, my son Alal. We will celebrate the wedding in a month. Now let's read Surah Al-Fatiha, since we are all in agreement. Listening to these words, I looked at you, Alal. You didn't look at me at that moment, Alal. You turned toward your friend Merzoug. You gave each other a very warm embrace. Two friends, two brothers. And I understood, seeing you entwined like that for a long time, too long, that there was a secret between you, a very special bond. Baba was even forced to intervene. He said to you, that's enough now, Alal, my son. Let go of Merzoug and give Malika a kiss on the head. You kissed me timidly in front of everyone. Merzoug smiled wide and warmly encouraged you. You returned to Merzoug, you looked at each other, you were excited, you embraced again, you were entwined again, in front of us all. You were not ashamed. What am I supposed to do? I thought, faced with such a spectacle. Who is marrying whom here? I understand and I don't understand. I see and I don't see. The world of men from the blood, solidarity between men of the blood, the gestures of men. Men spend the majority of their time together, man to man. What happens, happens. They touch each other while they wait. Nothing new. It's natural. Alal and Merzoug, it's natural. One shouldn't ask too many questions. Alal has a friend and a supporter, Merzoug. I shouldn't take that away from him. I'm not the only person in Alal's life and heart. I'm not jealous of Merzoug. Do you hear me, Alal? Even when I saw you together with my own eyes on the terrace of the house on top of each other, naked, I did not become jealous. It was night, summer. It was too hot, that's all. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't devastated. I know what life is like, the facts of life. Merzoug was here long before me. Merzoug is not a dangerous man. When he looks at me, his eyes don't change. His eyes are always full of tenderness. Marzouk is all that's left to me now that you're gone, Allah. When I see him, I see you. I make him food. I invite him over. He comes, he eats like you. He has the same mannerisms as you. He eats for you in memory of you. I don't cry. Marzouk predicted what was going to happen in Indochina. He did everything to stop you from going there. So far away, to fight for the French, to fight against people you didn't even know, to kill people who'd done nothing to you. You wouldn't hear any of it. I'll bring back money, a lot of money, and life will be good for the three of us. You, Malika, you, Marzouk, and me with you. We'll move out of my parents' house. We'll be free from my parents. We'll buy land that we'll cultivate. We'll have lots of children. We'll be comfortable. You'll see, I'll wage their war and I'll take their money. That's my mission. How naive you were, Alal, and how I regret not having followed my intuition, to do everything I could to stop you from walking into your own death. Death in a land that doesn't exist for us, a country that isn't real to us. We listened to you, Alal. You dreamt and constructed a prosperous future for us, in front of us. You convinced us. No, that's not true. You ate our brains. We let you leave. And then very quickly, very briefly, from the beginning of part 2. This is about the white woman who is trying to steal her daughter away. They were right, my children. That woman is white. So white. It's incomprehensible. How is she so white? It's not that skin that she has. No, it's not skin that she has. It's milk. My mouth is watering. Despite myself, I want to lick her, walk right up to her, and without saying a word, lick her skin, taste her skin very slowly, drink that milk. It's impossible, that skin. Especially here in Rabat, especially now in the middle of August, I'm drenched in sweat. My whole body is dripping, rivers and rivers of sweat. I can't take it anymore. I feel as if I'm going to faint. But she, who's not even from this country, is not sweating. She really isn't sweating. I stare and stare at her. I can't believe it. She walked the same path as me up to this monument, the Chala ruins. There's not a drop of sweat visible on her. What's her secret? It's unfair to be so white, so beautiful without makeup, and tolerate the blazing sun of Morocco so effortlessly. I was born and have always lived here, and yet I have no solution. The sun doesn't love me. It strikes me, splits my head open with migraines day and night, throws me into an ocean of cold and hot sweats. There's only her, white, fresh, well-dressed. There's only her and her milky skin. I'll stop.
So this is another vibe change for, so the last excerpt I'll be reading is from a book that will have 2 titles, one in the UK and one in the US. In the UK it will be called Checking Out, which I hate. But, and in the US it'll be called Supersaurio, which is the Spanish title. The reason for this is because the US sales team thought that Supersaurus, which is what I suggested, wouldn't work. And then at some point changed their mind, so they're going with the Spanish title. But anyway, it's the author, Meryem El Mehdati, is from the Canary Islands. Her parents are Moroccan immigrants. And she is heavily influenced by something that I have zero experience with, which is fan fiction. So this is an extremely different book that captures a much younger generation, and it's autofiction. It was a bestseller in Spain, published by Blackie Books, and it follows a young woman called Meryem El Mehdati who has graduated from her master's degree in translation, I believe, in Spain at a time when there are no jobs, and she doesn't have wealthy parents to lean on. She has immigrant parents, and she ends up in an internship at a ridiculous office setting. So it's more like an office novel that also explores identity, because she's the only person there who is not Spanish. I wouldn't even know how to put that. Who is not like hyphenated by her family. So this is from the very beginning. There isn't a lot to say apart from that context. My name is Meryem. That's 2 syllables, Meryem. The Y should sound like a J, but most of the time I'm Meryem or Meryem. I've also been called Meryem, 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 Myrene, Meryem, Miriam, Marian, Marie-Jeanne, Meryem. I have a folder on my cell phone with over 100 screen grabs of all the variations, reformulations, adaptations, and interpretations that have sprung from my name. It's a constant source of surprise. I'm Steven Spielberg, forever moved to tears. A rose by any other name, yada yada, I know, we study Shakespeare in Canary in public schools too. When you're called what I am, when your name is unusual, weird, I've never heard a name like that before. Where did you say it's from? You quickly learn an important lesson. Never, ever look annoyed that the person you're talking to can't handle a 2-syllable word. I was born, grew up, and now I've spent weeks of my life with someone calling me Meryem in work emails, and I think to myself, is it really so hard to copy and paste 6 puny letters? I take that thought, bottle it up, swallow it. I don't die. I just get more and more pissed off. I'm Canarian. Not only do I have the sexiest accent in all of Spain, according to multiple surveys, but I am also highly resilient. My 9th grade math teacher, Doña Mercedes, used to call me Marie-Jeanne. The first time she did this, I looked at her. She looked at me. We looked at each other, and I corrected her. For the next 9 months of my life, I was called Marie-Jeanne in her class. Open parentheses, I'm going to get very breathless. There's no punctuation. Some of the kids in school used to shout, Peter Parker, right after my name. I think about them sometimes. I hope they're well. One of them is a taxi driver now. One day I got in a taxi without checking, and then when I looked up, I saw it was him, and he recognized me. And I wanted to get out, but we were already moving. It was too late. I nearly threw up in the backseat of the taxi cab, and when I got out, he said something I didn't understand, and I ran away as fast as I could. A few days later, he found me on Facebook and wrote me a 4-paragraph-long DM apologizing for how he treated me when we were kids. And I went to his profile and blocked him. I hope he dies, and the last thing he sees is my face flashing before his eyes. Close parentheses. I wasn't going to get Doña Mercedes to crack, but she certainly got me to. In the end, I gave up, disbanded, turned in my weapons. I don't object to anything anymore. Meryem, no matter the name, it rolls right off me. Sometimes I'm called, it'll be faster if I just give you my ID card. I've realized I have nothing to gain by resisting. When I'm not Mayaneri or Meryane, I'm, that name isn't from here, or huh, you look Canarian, or that's such a pretty name, I've never heard it before, where are you from? It doesn't matter that I'm used to the string of questions, 25 years of explanations, it changes nothing. Just because I know the conversation by heart doesn't mean the endless interrogations don't weigh on my shoulders, and I don't feel any less powerless. I'm from here, from the island, I usually say, to which they usually reply, sure, but where exactly? I daydream about turning around and answering, what the fuck do you care where I'm from exactly, you dickbag? What do you actually want to know? Spit it out already. But if I did, then the person I'm talking to would get offended because they're not doing anything wrong, they're just wondering, they're curious. L'esprit de l'escalier, except I'm at the bottom of the staircase screaming that I've had it up to here with being patient and friendly and smiling and turning the other cheek all the time. There's no cheek left here, have this one, slap it instead if you want. From Morocco, I say finally. Even if it's a lie, because I was born here, raised here, educated here, lived here my whole life, right here.
So, all 3 very different books. And I think so in that last excerpt you read, it's not necessarily true to that experience of that narrator, whereas in Abdellah's work, it's always part of the central plot of the book and the character development. Like, hello, I'm a Moroccan writer writing about what it means to be North African in France, or to be North African dealing with French people, or to be a Moroccan woman who has been directly affected by French imperialism and French wars and colonization. And I'm curious, we're on this stage because our writers happen to be North African, but I'm sort of wondering what part that actually plays in the author's voices and the characters that they're writing and your translation process, if at all. And I'm thinking in Living Things, which is very funny and snarky and very, what is the word we used on the way here? Not self-referential, but concerned.
storytelling,
and
telling its own story.
Yeah, and concerned with itself, maybe. There's all this referencing to the fact that he's telling a story, and he's trying to be mindful of the narrator of how he's telling that story. And it's also a book steeped in European and South American literature and lots of references to different writers who are not North African. And there's also, it felt as if it was poking fun kind of at certain lineages and traditions of European or South American or like Latin American storytellers. And I'm wondering if the author's perhaps status as a quote unquote outsider, as someone has lineage from somewhere else in either cases, but specifically in Living Things, if that is informing the writing in some way and the way that you're translating the book.
So when I read this question earlier today, I had an answer ready for it, and now I'm like, ooh, this is more complicated than I thought. Because you're right, in Living Things and in Supersario / Checking Out, hyphenated in its title, it's not the center, it's just one other characteristic of the characters. It's not like the only thing that they're pushing against. As I explained earlier, for Munir, who is also the protagonist of Living Things, the way he addresses identity is, as Munir the author, the way he addresses identity is by presenting almost a self-hating man of North African descent, because he hangs out with a bunch of like Ernestos and Alexes, with like more Castilian last names, and starts absorbing their attitudes about the North African laborers around them. And they construct this whole conspiracy theory around what is happening. They end up working at these poultry farms and are encountered with like agricultural technology and bad labor conditions. And the fact that he and these people have all these prejudices leads them to position these North African men in the story as conspirators rather than victims of capitalism. And so I think the way that he comes at it is actually quite subtle and easy to miss, maybe. Like you can just think, oh, you could, if it wasn't Munir Hachemi writing this book, think, oh, we have a bit of a racist, sexist young man. But no, he's like constantly analyzing that. And then Meryem is very different. She's more concerned with being working class. I'm always talking about how the United States doesn't really know how to write a working class novel anymore, or it tends to either be about, in the UK, they love talking about class. In the US, we love talking about race. And we don't often see where these two things are so inextricable. And so she is very aware of both things, and I think sometimes touches on how they interact with each other. You know, immigrant families have to work very hard, cannot give themselves the privilege of just taking time off to do some random project and travel the world, because they need to pay rent and also have a different relationship with their families. And so it is not the center, but it is always very, very present. And I don't know if I answered your question.
You definitely answered
Okay.
my question.
Good.
Can I add a part to my question?
Yeah.
Is her name also Marie-Jeanne?
Yes.
Author?
Yeah.
Okay, making sure. So in her work, there's obviously that long stretch of no punctuation. And then I felt like in Munir's work, it's like a very, dare I say, masculine book. Very all the literary references are to men. When he has his like little list of how to tell a good story or how to become a good storyteller, including getting lots of experiences and having lots of sex with women, he says that he's gleaned all this advice from various writers, and he even points out that none of them are women, which makes you kind of pick up on the fact that it's maybe a spoof of the typical male writer who only reads men. But there's, like, I'm curious how there's such strong stylistic voices. So what for you was the most challenging part of translating that, or what was the most fun part of, how did you tackle that?
I watch a lot of television to help me. I read a lot in English to figure out how to get to the voices that I'm translating. And I think I looked at blogs for checking out. She has a very, very loose style. It's very chatty. I tried to find slang that was a little bit younger than me, because she is a little bit younger. I leaned on the internet a lot, which is a great resource. That's for her. For him, I actually read more of these authors. And I do think he's poking fun at like that sort of like a story about how to become an author. And by the end, you're like, maybe don't do any of the things that this character just did. I don't know, I feel like I've read so many of your translations, and this book by Abdellah Taïa is a very different voice from other voices that I've heard you do. And so I when I first started reading, I was like, ooh, this feels so different. I wonder how Emma got to this, because I remember very vividly going to an event that you did for Virginie Despentes, and I was like, this is like slangy, it's contemporary, it's hip, and this is so sorrowful and anxious and older feeling as well, the way the sentences are constructed, the way the repetition, and like the syntax is a little unusual as well, the emphasis on the end. So I guess the same question back at you. I have another one later.
Great. Yeah, I love translating Abdellah, because you actually texted me earlier that the word you used was incantatory, and I gave a talk about him yesterday, and I think I used the exact same word to describe his sentences. And for him, like, it's 100% about rhythm, and the sentences are really bare, very staccato. He's not adding in a bunch of unnecessary flourish, which would be the very French thing to do. Everything is kind of stripped down, and he uses a lot of repetition, and he uses, I think in what I read, the kind of ending a lot of sentences on someone's name, and it's the reader, it's as if the narrator is speaking directly to the reader, but they're speaking to somebody else, and it's funny because his other book that I translated, A Country for Dying, it's the same style. And that book is made up of 4 different voices, and they're all the same. And I don't mean they're literally the same. I mean, they have very different personalities, but the way he writes from book to book, it's as if you could be reading the same book. And it's done on purpose, and it's you get really swept up in it. And I think in that way, he actually is similar to Duras. And Duras, and especially this book, I mean, it's about his mother. There's this part where his mother says, I'm 25 years old, so young and already so old. And that's like, it's taken straight from Duras. And he's very inspired by Duras. And I've translated a few of her books, and she's a very important author to me. And it's the same kind of like, you have to just tap into a rhythm of the sentences, and then the syntax of the English has to just follow that rhythm. And as soon as you get that in, the rest just kind of doesn't matter and falls into place. And, certain words that might be the exact translation, they mess up the rhythm, and so you adjust, because it's all about kind of sweeping up the reader in a bit of a spell, because he's creating these very kind of universal voices. And so, yeah, my experience with Duras helped me, and my experience with this helped me with Duras, and I feel like they're very connected as writers.
So my last question, do I have time for one more? Shall I stop? Maybe I'll just let other
maybe,
people.
Maybe we could, because I think that the whole question of rhythm and memory and all of that will lead beautifully into the next
Sure.
All right,
into the next
perfect.
segment, and then we'll come back and try it all.
Yes, it was beautiful as you used each other. We met first of all, we introduced us as a, not as a couple, but I mean as a we. So we got to know each other. I think the first time we met was in Berlin. So it's a European-American story, or American-European global story. And then in Paris, and now in New York. And so Tess is a wonderful translator from the German language and from the French language into English, of course. And I think you won many prizes. I think you are also the editor of literary magazine online.
Hudson Review.
Hudson Review. And there would be many other things to tell about you, but we traveled a lot together and had a lot of conversations, but maybe it's not the place to talk about this. And I don't know, I'm just a writer and translator.
Well, we're not just a writer. So Cécile has written at least 17 books, a lot of essays. She translates from German and from English into French. She taught French for a while and had never heard of the Riccoboni, which is interesting. So from English, she has translated Charles Olson, Virginia Woolf, a number of authors she won't admit to having translated. But the Virginia Woolf, of course, is key to this evening. This book is a novel about translating Virginia Woolf. Cécile translated Three Guineas, The Waves, and a number of essays. And so to me, what's very interesting about this event and Cécile and this novel's place in it is that Virginia Woolf, of course, is part of the canon now, but she was not only herself outside the canon working to get her way in with Hogarth Press and all her book reviews, but her essays as well take the canon apart. In How Should One Read a Book, for example, she talks about the importance of each person bringing their own experiences and knowledge to a book, and not to, get upset or be intimidated by the scholars who come in the library, furred and gowned as they may be. And so there's that level of upending the canon that's going on in the ambience around this novel, but the novel itself uses translation as a way to unpack this now canonical author and look at her on a word by word, a sentence by sentence level, also putting her in the context of her own work and literary history. All the while tying in the High Line, Chernobyl, ecological disaster. It's really a meditation on what translation can do to change the way we look at the world and our place in it and what we read.
Maybe I could read just
I think we'll
Yeah.
do, if you read the beginning in French.
in French. Okay.
Up to the passage right up to eternity. And then I'll read that and then another page or two in English. So that the premise of the book is a woman who is translating Virginia Woolf into French, loses a close friend, and she decides that one way to cope with her grief would be to apply for a residency in Dresden and translate time passes there, because it's a chapter, a section about the passage of time and the destruction of time in a city that was destroyed by time, and she would be sealed off from the language because although Cécile knows German, she spends half her time in Berlin, the narrator does not. And we can talk about process later, I guess.
Yeah. So it works with quotes from Virginia Woolf's book, and we are in the mind, in the translator's mind, which is coping with the quotes, with the sentences, and trying to, trying various variations about how she could translate those sentences. Well, we must wait for the future to show, said Mr. Banks, coming in from the terrace. Il faut attendre que l'avenir se montre, dit Mr. Banks, venant de la terrasse. Il faut attendre de voir ce que l'avenir nous réserve, dit Mr. Banks, arrivant de la terrasse. Il faut attendre que le futur se montre, dit Mr. Banks, entrant à l'intérieur depuis la terrasse. Il faut voir ce que l'avenir nous réserve, dit Mr. Banks, entrant de la terrasse. Voyons ce que l'avenir nous réserve. Attendons de voir ce que l'avenir... Eh bien, il faut attendre que l'avenir, dit Mr. Banks, arrivant de la terrasse. Il était une fois une femme qui écrivait dans une grande ville, une capitale, écrivait la maison perdue au bord de la mer où elle n'allait plus depuis longtemps, et le temps perdu, ou plutôt le passage du temps. Une femme écrivain qui cherchait à saisir l'instant, disait-elle, mais aussi la trace de la présence humaine dans l'éternité.
We must wait for the future to show, said Mr. Banks, coming in from the terrace. We must wait for the future to appear, said Mr. Banks, coming in from the terrace. We must wait and see what the future brings, said Mr. Banks, entering from the terrace. We must wait for the future to show, said Mr. Banks, as he entered the house from the terrace. We must see what the future has in store, said Mr. Banks, coming in from the terrace. Let's see what the future has in store. Let us wait and see what the future... Well, we must wait for the future, said Mr. Banks, entering from the terrace. There once was a woman who wrote, in a large city, a capital. She wrote about a house lost on the coast, a place she had stopped going long before, and she wrote about a lost time, or rather about the passage of time. A writer who was trying to capture the moment, as she said, but also trying to capture traces of human presence in eternity. Trying to capture them in a book called To the Lighthouse, a title translated into French as La Promenade au Phare, the stroll to the lighthouse. The movement of the word to is implicit in the word promenade, but can you call taking a boat to a lighthouse a stroll? And aren't strolls, by definition, taken on solid ground? Later, there will be other versions of the title. Voyage au phare, trip to the lighthouse. Vers le phare, au phare, bound for the lighthouse, toward the lighthouse. All of them run aground somewhat on the obviousness of to and are unable to reproduce it. The first German translation is called Die Fahrt zum Leuchtturm, the trip to the lighthouse. A more recent version is Zum Leuchtturm, to the lighthouse. German offers more opportunities for literal translation than French because it can trace the English construction. But this result is compact, the syllables too dense compared to the airy sound of the English title. Perhaps that's why the first translation added die Fahrt, the equivalent of the French promenade, but unlike a promenade, Fahrt contains the idea of a distance to be covered, one that gradually requires some means of transport, which could be a boat or a sailboat. In this sense, Voyage au phare would be the most exact with the same number of syllables as the English title and its light, breezy tone. Even if voyage or journey seems a bit exaggerated for a simple crossing, an excursion. But didn't this journey last more than 10 years? And who can measure the duration of a journey? It begins long before the simple transit and ends long after, if it ever does end. Translation is an inexact science, an attempt that's always doomed, not to failure, but to imperfection. In transit from one language to another, the ferryman's boat encounters obstacles that it confronts or skirts. Strong waves or gentle swells, quickening currents or countercurrents. Translation is a crossing with a point of departure and a point of arrival, but what lies between the two, the passage with its reefs and shallows, is known only by one person, the one who has passed through every stage. It's a difficult book to talk about in sections because there's so much interwoven. One of the reasons that Time Passes was so evocative for Cécile in writing this novel is the way nature is portrayed in that section. So maybe you could talk about what inspired you to write this and how you went about it.
I try to do it shortly because I think the main point should be the challenge of translating such a book into English, into every language, but specifically into English, because it's about someone trying to translate an English text into French, and then this text, French text with English inside of it, is being translated into English. And so I just tell it shortly that the coincidence, while rereading Time Passes, the central section into the lighthouse, between what Virginia Woolf describes as an overwhelming nature taking possession of abandoned house where the inhabitants, the human beings are no more there because of First World War, because of the mother's death. The coincidence with documentary films or pictures I've seen, and we have all seen, of Chernobyl and of the forbidden zone after the disaster, the Chernobyl disaster. And I thought it's incredible how those two things meet and how it should be so fascinating to do a film about it and to take Virginia Woolf's text just as comment, as voiceover for the pictures of the forbidden zone. And so that's what I tried to do in a book. But in order to write a novel, I had to imagine something. I am not a detective novel or thriller novel writer, but I had to imagine a minimal plot. And my idea was to use the process of translating as a plot. And so I would really like to ask you, Tess, to speak about the different strategies or the confrontation you had with the text, the fact of translating into English something dealing with translation from the English.
Of course, it's different when you hear that first paragraph than when you see it on the page, because with the eye you can register more of the variations than you can with the ear, punctuation being one of them. But my idea was, the crazy idea was that it would be possible to translate this book and have it serve a slightly different function for English readers than it did for French readers. And my hope was that by mimicking the variations that the translator into French does with each sentence, not only does it bring to life what's going on in our heads when we're trying to work through a book sentence by sentence, but it also focuses more sharply the reader, certainly me, on Virginia Woolf's style and what she did, her idiosyncrasies, the way she used word order in slightly unconventional ways to stress a certain element of the sentence, or for rhythm, or perhaps even out of carelessness, because she wrote this very quickly. And there are some sentences at least one, maybe more, in the English edition that don't scan. They make no sense if you take them apart. If you read them quickly, then it works. But if you actually have to sit and translate it, they're two incomplete sentences that are mashed together. And so the narrator in this, the detective element of this novel is when the narrator has to untie these mysteries of Virginia Woolf's sentences.
Just adding about Virginia Woolf, there has always been an English and an American edition, and there are some differences between both of them. And in the case of that sentence, which is difficult to understand in the English edition, the American edition is much more simple.
They correct it, as it were.
Yes, and it's not very clear whether she did it or whether the publisher did it.
But I felt also that doing too much of that mimicking of the translator's variations would bog the English language reader down in a way that the French reader is not bogged down. So I had my different strategies. I've got my visual prop here, where I wanted to keep track of what I was doing, so I used different color Post-it notes for each issue, each problem. And so unfortunately, the orange is fading into yellow, so pretty soon it won't be as helpful. But oh dear, and I'm even losing some. The yellow, the light yellow, is as in the beginning of the book, when I recreated in English the variations that the French translator is working through. And in the blue sections, which happen more frequently as the book goes on, I've cut some of those variations to tighten up the narrative tension, the drive, or if the sentence is quite simple and there's no point in varying it, like were they allies, were they enemies? There are not that many options, even into French and then back out of French. And then in the orange, in the case of the orange Post-its, I left some of the French in. And I did this when the narrator was making a point about the way French functions differently than English, when, for example, the verb tenses don't align, or how you use adverbs and nouns and word order, that sort of thing. So it was very complicated, and there's fuchsia too, and the fuchsia was when I was just despairing of getting it right. And whether I got it right or not, I thought I should just leave it in the book to remind myself how often I was tearing my hair out. So it is, in a sense, a different book than yours.
Yes, because I find it's something amazing, and maybe if we have a little more time, we can come back to Virginia Woolf and this canon question. But because we all know about translation, and of course there is an original text and a translated text, and it's not quite the same. And when you spoke about this novel from the 18th century, which you could, which will be published in the two languages, when you have poetry in both languages, so you can compare both texts, and you can see when you know the original language that it's not, it's something different. But of course it works, but it's different. But what is specific about the English book and about your work is that you can feel it, but in the same language, which never happens. So you can figure out a certain amount of variations in the same language, and so you can compare with the original text, and you can see, even if you have no idea of what French language is or any other language, just with the English language, you have the obvious proof that the translation is not exactly, is an approach of the original text, but not exactly the original text. And that's what I find amazing, and what I admire in Tess's book, I can say. I think your name should stand there.
I'm not sure. Wouldn't go that far.
Well,
Do you have questions? Or is this a good time to bring everybody
Sure.
back? Yes? Yeah, well, please come to the stage, such as it is.
And Lori, knowing German very well, and we would go through my translation together, and she would have comments on what I was translating, and sometimes had objections. Was that the case with you two as well?
Not for this one.
no.
No.
And it's the only one, so.
I have had that experience. Sometimes it's less pleasant than at other times. But I did, when I had questions, Cécile was very helpful. I mean, another thing that I should say is that Cécile's translator into German, Anne Weber, is someone whose books I have translated, but she translated Nevermore into German, so I had two resources to ask.
But as a translator also, I think, and we are all the translators here, that we must get free from the authors also, because it's something else, translating than writing, and I think the author shouldn't intrude so much. So when there are questions from the translator, it's okay to answer, of course, but you, as an author, you shouldn't go ahead and ask, oh, could I check what you did? And everyone must be free in its own work.
So I had a question about listeners. When you were translating a book, you had also the original text of the way she wrote it. And I was wondering if you were trying to steer away from her, like kind of adding another layer of the translation, or you were trying to get back close to her.
I did reread Time Passes, and you don't have to read it to appreciate the book, but it brings another layer to it. And I wanted to stay close because I didn't want to lose the feel of Virginia Woolf's style, even though it gets distorted through the lens of French. I wanted to at least maintain that atmosphere in the book. But the nice thing about this book also is the way Cécile looks at Virginia Woolf, both in general and specifically through Time Passes. And there's a section where she talks about the way Virginia Woolf flips the perspective, and nature is humans are secondary and nature is the main character. And the narrator asks, has there been another work in literature where this shift in perspective of what did you call it? Tonalities, maybe? Like a major key for nature and a minor key for humans. And she just leaves the question there. But that was another way of, weaving in and out of Virginia Woolf's language and her preoccupations.
Well, maybe it happens now, but a century ago, I don't think it did happen. It's maybe, I would like to know which books from Duras you translated.
La Vie Tranquille, The Easy Life in English, and then there was a collection of her nonfiction work that was like from newspaper writings, paired with L'été qui travaille. Yeah.
That's great.
We posed this panel as kind of interlocking. Do you, having listened to one another, do you think that is, that do you see parallels? For example, I think the sense of estrangement in, in the youngest author, I think the objection to being seen and to being always othered is very upfront. But that's a kind of translation, constantly having to translate herself for the people around her. And Spain is very uptight about difference. So there's a translation element there. There's definitely a translation element. And I mean, it's interesting in that sense. I'm not sure if Riccoboni is, that's an earlier. I had a question about Riccoboni, which was, in fact, it felt very modern, that sex scene. The fact that you don't know exactly what's happening and all of that. And also when we're both talking about the fact that she, she pushed back against Laclau's idea of what a woman could be and all of that. She seemed to be combining the masculine and feminine that were, very separate. I don't know. I mean, she's kind of translating a woman's experience for the male audience, or for an audience that's dominated by male writers.
Yeah, definitely. Well, one thing that came to my mind was thinking about Virginia Woolf, because Virginia Woolf was one of the first authors to really look at like the blue stockings, 18th century, like British women authors. And I recently read this great book by Susanna Gibson about the blue stockings, whom she calls like the first women's movement. So all these female authors in the 18th century who were sometimes met with like ridicule, right? I mean, blue stocking was like at first a positive term for men and women, and then it became associated only with women authors, and then it became kind of laughed at, like, oh, these ridiculous women who think that they're writers, right? Just like in France, there was like the legacy of like women authors in the 17th century called les précieuses, who were then, if you're a précieuse, oh, you're silly and you write in this like ridiculous, overblown style, and no one takes you seriously.
There is this comedy from Molière.
Exactly.
Making them ridiculous.
Right, and so all of a sudden then they no longer, what does it mean to be a female author? You're going to get stuck with this label. And Virginia Woolf was, at the end of this book about the blue stocking, she mentions that Virginia Woolf really kind of rehabilitated a lot of these authors and really, wanted to like kind of bring them back into the public eye. So maybe just that question of like who gets to be an author, right? Who gets to share their experience is maybe something that does bind, these different writers together.
Oh, I have a question. No, go ahead. So my question has to do, I have it's a two-part question. One is about authority and the other one is about joy. So I'm a social scientist and a historian, so I'm translating documents all the time. And I'm not interested necessarily in the artistry. I need to write some article that I'm using documents for. Maybe I am, just a little bit. But when I hear you and your point that somebody who's translating the author should not get involved. The question comes to me is, so where do you as a translator get your authority from? Is it your education? What is it that happens that you say, voila, that's what I want, or that's the right one? And then the other thing is that what translation is also this sort of liminal project. And what is it about that gives you joy in doing that? Like what is, so I'm interested if anybody can sort of the authority as well as the joyous part of translation.
I can speak to the liminal part there. And when we, is that the part being connected to the joy?
It could be.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, because for me, I feel very, which I think is also maybe your experience. I don't know your backgrounds. I won't speak for you all, but this feeling of being not fully one thing in my identity and feeling very confused about my father's Lebanese, but I have spent very limited time in Lebanon, and my mother's English, but I'm raised in America, and all the feelings of being American, and I think translation, and I can only really think about this now after 12-ish years of translating, but I think it offered me something I didn't have anywhere else, which was that you get to be in between, and that's exactly where you're supposed to be. And being able to kind of shuttle back and forth, I felt very at home in that space, and I continue to feel very at home in that space in a way that I don't feel anywhere else in my life. I'll stop there.
I mean, it's the same for me. I've moved around a lot. My family's Brazilian, but I've lived in Mexico, here, Scotland, Spain, Switzerland. And it was the only way that I could find of connecting everything. I've been teaching recently, and I had this writer and translator called Bruna Dantas Lobato, who's Brazilian and has lived in the US for a very long time, Zoom in, and she talks about how, even though she started off as a writer and she writes in English, it's translation that allowed her to be fully herself, because she felt that when she was writing in English, she had to keep her Brazilian self away. There wasn't room for it on the page. I'm curious about the question about authority, because I think it's almost two different questions. There's authority, sort of like what you hinted at education, like what makes you think that you have what it takes maybe to be a translator. And then there was decision making, which they feel like slightly different things to me. I yammer on and on and on about how I feel like there's a third generation of translators right now, second, third, who are immigrants and children of immigrants translating into English, and this has long not been the case. And I think that we bring a very different perspective to the act of translation, and our authority does not necessarily come from our education. Our authority can come from lived experience. When I translate Brazil, I have a very effective thing that I'm translating. I have to do all the research as well, but there's a different connection, and that didn't exist 10 years ago when I started, so this is very, very new to me. But when it comes to decision making, it's that, I mean, translation is an art. Literary translation is an art. I can't speak for all kinds of translation. And so there is something that isn't quite tangible that you feel. And it's like, oh, this works. Oh, this clicks. And I think there's a way to balance. You have to, and please correct me, I can't speak for all translators either, but you have to balance spontaneity and thorough research and work. Because if you work a sentence to the point, to a certain point, like it stops, it's almost like you wring its humanity out of it. And it's supposed to evoke something. And I think that you can tell when a sentence has been, I don't know, twisted too much and thought about too much. But I don't know if that jives with anyone else's experiences.
Absolutely. In terms of authority, my feeling is that I agree very strongly, passionately with, George Steiner and others who believe that each translation is an interpretation. And so, in effect, there can't be too many. So where I get my sense of authority, which is sometimes shaky, but it's, when I try to recreate for the English language reader my experience of reading a text, so that means it will be limited by my boundaries, but it will also be opened by my boundaries. So I guess I find my authority in my subjective reading of the text in an attempt to recreate it.
Question for all of you, which I think should be interesting, since you're talking about authority and how you feel sort of authorized to translate certain authors or certain books. What do you think about artificial intelligence? Is this a tool that you use at some point in your... I know I wasn't sure if it was politically incorrect. But very politically correct. But no, I think that right after listening to you, what you said about how passionate you feel about what you're translating, I thought, well, I think it's probably the right moment to ask this question, because in a way you have sort of this dismantle, let's say, the AI authority. So I don't know what you think about this tool.
I mean, I think it's an enormous threat, not because it will replace us as translators, though it may well do that. The most immediate threat I feel coming from artificial intelligence is that the ease with which you can get something that's just okay. I mean, it's good enough. You get the sense of it. It's not a literary work. It translates certain elements of meaning and order, but it's not at the point where it's good enough to bring the creativity that I think you have to bring, the subjectivity that you have to bring. Maybe it will get there someday, I don't know. But what I see happening is that some publishers are using it as a way to squeeze the translators by saying, I don't want a translation, I just want you to post-edit, which takes as much time and work as it does. Yeah. So in an already precarious ecosystem, I think it's like toxic sludge. But other than that, I mean, for lawnmower manuals or microwave instructions, it's fine. But for literary work, it's sometimes, or not. Or not. So.
Very briefly, I think that AI, I'm almost bored of talking about it in relation to translation, because it's being used right now to revoke visas and to target immigrants. And so it is an extremely dangerous thing that is not being controlled, and it's being used to target minorities and
government workers.
And it is helping bolster our technocrat, our tech overlords, and there's far too many resources being given to AI when we need resources elsewhere. I think it can be probably useful also in scientific spheres, but I don't know, the discussion about creativity is almost like, it's not interesting to me, it's not something I want to engage with, and it's also like stealing all of our labor in order to create it, and they're not paying licensing fees, and they're just getting rich at our expense. And so I get all worked up about it.
So I would like to give us a little hope, because when the e-books appeared, everyone said it will be the end of paper books. And in 10 years ahead, there won't be any paper books, any more paper books. And we are 10 years later, and there are still bookshops, paper books, and so on. So I don't think AI, and of course you are right, it's a very dangerous tool and it's being used, but about translation and literary translation, I don't think it will replace us as human translators.
Question.
I come from this from totally different thing from literary, but in listening to everybody speak here, it's very similar. They all do the same thing as a musician would do with classical music, making an interpretation and trying to figure what was the composer doing at that moment, what was going on in the composer's life at that particular time, and then putting your own interpretation of that into translating music and making it very alive for the listener that's listening to it now. So it's a very similar thing. I'm just...
As a pianist.
Right, well, it's especially interesting when you think of interpretations of Bach and how revolutionary Glenn Gould was, but
Right.
now it's...
Exactly, or Mozart now, because again, all those composers wrote music on different instruments than they are played now. And what is on the printed page, like if you, for the dynamics, it's not necessarily the dynamic when you see a piano pianissimo, that's not necessarily the same as now how it would sound on a piano or whatever other instrument. So it's the artist interpreting it, and they're trying to be as knowledgeable about the time as well, but also bringing it into a voice of today.
A lot of the writing about translation used to evoke, it's the translator is like the violinist who's looking at the, and that, I think it's really the whole question of a jazz, a version, something that takes it beyond, it takes it to another place is more than just a performance of a text, right? I'm asking, I know. But Alex, you had a question before? Has that been answered?
It's much more down to earth. It was about, you said that this book, Riccoboni, was a bestseller. Who was buying books back then? Because nowadays, if a book is a bestseller, that means it's being bought mostly by women. Was that true at that time too?
Yeah, novels, women were the major readers of novels, so.
Haven't they always been?
Yeah, I mean,
I feel like we don't really talk enough about that when we talk about the canon changing. Like, how did it even happen that, if women were the bestsellers at the beginning, women were mostly buying books at the beginning, or novels, I should say. Women are mostly buying novels now. Was there some, time in the early 20th century when all of a sudden men were buying most of the novels, and so they took over the whole world of criticism and decided what the canon was? How did that happen? I didn't study literature, you can tell. Probably some people are sitting here thinking, what a stupid question.
there are probably different answers in different places and different time periods. I mean, from a French perspective, you could say that in the 19th century, that's when the novel becomes serious, right? And that's when you have Balzac and you have Flaubert and you have Hugo, and all of a sudden you have 800-page novels that are, bricks that, are now a high art form, right?
Were there critics in the 18th century too?
Yeah.
That's another question, actually.
Yeah, and the critics, and I made sure to point this out in my introduction, she was not only a bestseller, but she also received critical acclaim, because you might say, well, okay, being a bestseller, but does that really guarantee literary quality, or is that just, that there were steamy scenes, or, what does that mean, So she was also praised by critics, including Diderot and, other, high profile writers of the time. But yeah, so in the French scene, certainly it's the 19th century when the novel becomes more serious. And then now that it's not a frivolous genre so much anymore, then it's kind of okay, well now it's associated with male grandeur, right? And at that point, that's kind of another literary historical reason that then authors like Riccoboni are kind of forgotten, because it's like a different approach to the novel that they're looking at.
I'm thinking now of the title of this series, what brought us all together, and it strikes me that your translation project is, the rewriting of the historical canon. If you go to university, you might, and do a basic English Lit 101, you'll think that women never wrote anything until 100 years ago. And the writers that we're translating now are creating a new canon that stands against the canon that was, which did not include many writers of color at all. And then this is the process by which we're creating it.
I think that's a beautiful place to sit.